I was at the New Jersey fly fishing show with Julia Zima, our social media person, and we were walking around. She said, let's do something live on Instagram. And I said, okay. And we were standing next to this booth that was doing tattoos. She said, why don't you get a tattoo? And I looked over and I said, well, yeah, okay, let's do it. And I was walking back to the Orvis booth, and some guy comes up to me and says, hey, I heard you got a tattoo. I said, yeah, where'd you hear that? He said, oh, from my son who's in Iraq. He just saw it live on Instagram in a space of like 3 minutes.
Welcome to the Wild South Podcast. I'm Dave DiBenedetto, Editor-in-Chief of Garden & Gun Magazine.
And I'm Eddie Nickens, Contributing Editor for Garden & Gun.
Together, we're talking with the most interesting outdoorsmen and outdoors women in the South and beyond.
Quail hunters and duck hunters, trout anglers and redfish fanatics, musicians, scientists, writers, wild game cooks, and frankly, a few wildcats we dig up along the way.
We're talking with legends and legends in the making.
All with unforgettable stories of life way beyond the sidewalk. Today we're talking to Tom Rosenbauer. Now, this is a man who he is synonymous with fly fishing. He's synonymous with the Orvis brand. He's synonymous with this thoughtful, passionate, but really approachable way of coming into the fly fishing world. David, I know you've had a friendship with Tom forever. I am so stoked to have him on this podcast.
One thing about Tom that I just love is he is a fish hound. There is not a time that Tom Rosenbauer doesn't want to fish. I mean, look, I'm addicted to fishing. No doubt about it, right? But I don't think my passion even comes close to what thrives inside of Tom Rosenbauer. And what's pretty cool about Tom, Eddie, is that he's taken that passion and just spread his knowledge across the entire fly fishing universe.
Yeah, and the spectrum as well. You know, I mean, he sort of preaches to the front row, the back row, the balcony, hardcore, the newbies. I'm going to tell you one thing I don't love about Tom Rosenbauer is the man has written almost 30 books. 30 books. I'm the writer here, and he is smoking me.
He's productive. He hits his deadlines, T. Edward. He does. I mean, his books, again, synonymous, right, with learning how to fly fish. And then all the other books that are geared toward the expert level fly fishermen. He's covered it all.
He has. I've got one of his books I've got several of his books in the office, but I pulled out my favorite, which is called Reading Trout Streams. And it's funny. It was posted in 1988, and there's all of these hand-drawn illustrations. I don't think Tom drew them, but they're, all of the trout in the stream are these black trout-shaped blobs, and the rocks with moss dotted on them, and the bubble lines and the eddy lines are these little open bubbles. It's just very simple. But I mean, even today, when I see a trout lie in my mind, I'm seeing it from the pages of the book. Oh, I know that black blob of my trout is right there. And I sort of, the bubble lines all sort of appear in real time. It's, I don't think we think about the Rosenbauer way like it truly exists in the fly fishing world. It's how so many of us learned reading his books, even not really knowing how important he was. I feel like most of us who fish, we wear this invisible bracelet that says WWTD. What would Tom do? We blow up a knot. How would Tom tie this knot?
Hey, let's start selling those on order. So when I started doing the research for my book On the Run, which I'll do a little shameless plug here, which was about me following the migration of the striped bass from the fall migration from Maine to North Carolina in the fall of 2001. And the way to do that was to hook up with as many fish heads as I could along the way and tell their stories. And one of the first calls I made was to Tom. And as usual, Tom was happy to share every bit of knowledge he had, not only about the striper, but really about the people he thought I should meet the guides, the conservationists, and he let me use his name. I mean, he was an entree for me in a way that was extremely helpful.
I think listeners are going to pick up on that. At every turn, we try to get Tom to, pound his chest and talk about big fish and that sort of thing. And he just turns it around. He's like, look, that's not what this game is about. Let me talk about how to make you a better angler. I mean, what a sweet guy.
Yeah. No doubt. Let's get to it.
Let's do it. Tom Rosenbauer is on deck. Let's cast him a big old fluffy sparkle dun. Did you like what I did there? Huh? Did you get that? Hey, Tom Rosenbauer.
Hey, Eddie, how are you?
Man, I think I'm going to make it.
Good. I think I am too, at least for the rest of the day.
Yeah.
Tom Rosenbauer.
Hey, David.
What a delight to have you on the show. I was telling Eddie earlier that you and I first met in, I think it was about 1997. I was at a magazine called Men's Journal. And at that time, you were already the guy that any editor worth his waders needed to know. And now, some 20 years later plus, you have become the most recognizable face of Orvis. So I'm going to start with a hard-hitting question.
Okay.
Tell us about your groupies.
There are some. There's like a group on Reddit, which I don't look at Reddit.
Yeah.
But occasionally people will tell me about things that are being discussed there. And there's a bunch of internet meme people that make some amusing memes of me, which I'm always flattered by. I think they're funny as hell.
Am I to understand there is a Tom Rosenbauer subreddit?
Yeah, I think so.
Wow. Okay.
That's another level, Tom.
Eddie, I've never looked at it. I don't really want to get into the Reddit rabbit hole.
Is anybody stopping you on the street for autographs or you get recognized? I mean, besides at a fly fishing show, do you get recognized?
People don't ask for autographs, but I do get recognized in airports a lot. There seem to be a lot of fly fishermen among Delta pilots. They'll stop me when I'm walking from one terminal to the other and say, hey, are you Tom? And nobody asks me for autographs or anything, but, they just stop and say they appreciate the podcast or the videos or whatever. It's always super flattering. I come home and tell my wife, and she laughs about it.
She knows the truth.
What's interesting to me, though, speaking about Reddit and the World Wide Web and Tom Rosenbauer's, is how little there is out there about Tom Rosenbauer. I mean, we know what you think about knots and flies and why you like fluorocarbon leaders for saltwater fishing and so many, just incredibly useful details about the technical aspects of fly fishing. But I personally know very little about who you are and where you grew up, how you got started. I mean, even your Wikipedia biography is pretty lame. I gotta say, Tom.
Yeah. Good.
I do know this about you. We have this much in common. Neither one of us growing up was much into sports. We both spent our time in creeks and catching snakes, during which I had the not super cool derogatory nickname of Nature Boy.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have to suffer any of that up in the Northeast, Tom, growing up? Tell us a little bit about your upbringing.
Yeah. I used to follow football, believe it or not, when I was in college, pro football. But I don't know. Life's too short for that, too. There's too many interesting things to do than sit around and watch people bouncing a ball around on TV.
What was that youth like? You were commercially tying flies at the age of 14.
I was a real boring nerd. I was into fly fishing and nature stuff and didn't really participate in much high school stuff.
Did your parents teach you about fly fishing or?
Neither of my parents fly fished. My father took me fishing when I was a kid. He was a worm fisherman, and we used to go and sit on the shores of Lake Ontario and catch bullheads and white perch and stuff like that. I really took to it and decided that I wanted to learn how to fly fish because it looked interesting. I'd see it in Field and Stream or on the American Sportsman on TV. And I just taught myself, and it was a horrible process with no videos, no schools. And the few books that were around were really not very good teaching tools. So I had to really suffer through it and struggle. and I wasn't a very patient kid, so I think I'd probably drove my parents crazy.
You had no mentors? You didn't have anybody?
No, not really. When I started tying flies, there was a gentleman who unfortunately just passed away named Carl Coleman, who had a little fly shop in Rochester, New York, where I grew up. And he kind of took me under his wing, and I tied flies for his shop. He liked my flies, and he taught me a lot about fly tying. And then he took me fishing a few times. I learned a ton from him. I mean, I went to the State College of Environmental Science and Forestry, and there wasn't even another fly fisherman in that whole college
Wow.
in those days. I mean, now there's a lot of fly fishing going on
Right.
in college campuses
Right.
and clubs and things, but there wasn't then. So it wasn't until I really started working for Orvis that I got to meet other people who knew a ton more than I did.
What was it about fly fishing? You had this, we won't call it an epiphany then, but your transition from worm fishing with your pop to what is it about fly fishing that attracted you?
Well, I think it's something that, I've watched how people learn and watched how kids learn and how kids turn on to fly fishing. And I've discovered that when kids are really young, they just want to catch fish and yank them in, right? Mm-hmm. And then when they get to be about 10 or 11 or 12, they start to look for more complexity. And I think that I was a good example of that I just wanted to do something that was more of a challenge maybe. And probably a bit of a snobbish, fly fishing was kind of the epitome of fishing and probably kind of a snobbish appeal as well. I mean, looking back, I didn't think then, but I think now that's probably why it appealed to me.
And so you get to the Orvis Company right out of college.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
You're on the retail floor, I think, right?
Yeah. I finished my undergraduate degree in biology and tried to concentrate in fisheries. I wanted to get into fisheries or aquatic entomology for a living as a biologist. And I really didn't have enough money to go to grad school. I didn't come from a wealthy family. And so I knew about Orvis. I had been an Orvis customer. When I was a kid making money tying flies, I spent my money on fly fishing gear. And I saw an ad for a position at Orvis, and I said, oh, that'd be cool. I'd make some money for grad school. And 48 years later, I haven't gone back to grad school yet.
What was Orvis like 48 years ago? I mean, Lee Perkins was in charge, right?
He was, yeah. Lee was in charge, and he was old school. He was the boss.
Right.
And everybody was scared to death of him. But, I went to Orvis thinking I was going to meet all these famous anglers and hang around with Lee Wolf, and I ended up basically measuring inseams on chinos from wealthy people from Connecticut. I mean, in those days, Orvis was kind of a finishing school for wealthy kids that went to prep school, and they would go and work for Orvis for a couple of years, and then they'd inherit daddy's business or whatever. So it was a whole different world then. These days in the Orvis stores, you got people that are really into fly fishing and really dedicated to it, and you got people coming in that want to talk about the new rods and flies and fly tying, and it's a whole different world now.
So let's talk about innovation for a minute.
Uh-huh.
According to the interwebs, Tom, you have invented the big eye hook, the magnetic net retriever, and you brought the beadhead fly to the United States. Of all those things, I want to hear a little bit about how the beadhead fly came to the U.S.
Well, the beadhead fly, it was originally a caddis nymph, was developed by a guy named Roman Mosier in Austria. He was probably the most famous angler in Austria. And somebody sent us a VHS tape, which was all in German, of him fishing. And in that, he had this caddisfly with a gold bead that he put on the head of it to get it to sink better and also to add a little flash to it. And I thought, it looks kind of interesting. So we got some brass beads from Worth Tackle, and I tied up a bunch of them and didn't think much of them. I gave a whole bunch away to friends, and when I'd go out like to Colorado and Montana, I'd give them to guides and stuff. And I sort of forgot about them.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, the sprinkling of those bead heads, it just took off.
Wow.
And I didn't develop them, but I think I brought them to North America. As far as I know, nobody else had them at that time.
You sowed the beadhead seed, so to speak.
I did, yeah.
And then you took it to the tungsten level, right?
Yeah. I used to go to this fly fishing lodge in July, around 4th of July, and there was a guest there that was named Ron Kurtz. And we got to talking at dinner one evening, and I said, "Hey, Ron, what business are you in? You never told me." And he said, "Oh, I'm in the tungsten business. I make darts and counterweights for feeding tubes and people." And at the time, Yellowstone Park was thinking of banning beadheads because apparently the brass has a little bit of lead or some other things in it.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And so I said, "Ron, is tungsten inert?" And he said, "Oh, yeah, it's totally inert. It's not toxic or anything." And I said, "Is it heavy?" And he said, "Yeah, it's almost as heavy as lead." I said, "Could you make beads?" He said, "Yeah, I can make beads." So he made beads.
And so those beads went right into Orvis production of flies, and you guys were the first with tungsten beadhead flies.
Yeah.
I mean, this was news to me. I mean, the bead head, for folks who don't know, is you string a metal bead onto the hook before you tie the fly, or I guess that's the first step maybe of tying the fly.
Yeah, it's the first step.
And it adds weight. I mean, honestly, last night I was tying bead-headed shad flies.
Mm-hmm.
Tom, do I need to Venmo you some royalty? Is this something that I'm not supposed to be doing? Is this all yours?
Yeah, you should definitely Venmo me some money, Eddie. I'll give you my info and you can Venmo me.
Let's stick with this theme of innovation, change. This is astonishing me, Tom. More than 300,000 copies of the book you wrote, Orvis Fly Fishing Guide, have been sold. That's crazy. The book was first published in 1984.
Yeah, my first book.
I think it was revised heavily in 2007 and maybe 2017. I've got a copy of it right here on my desk. I'm wondering, what changes, what additions would you feel like you have to make if you were to do a 2024 edition?
The main thing, I think, Eddie, would be Euro nymphing. I mean, the latest version has a little bit of the Euro nymphing, which for people who aren't familiar with it is basically fishing with monofilament and not a fly line and lobbing a heavy flyer out into the current. It has a number of advantages in that it doesn't have the fly line dragging the fly all over, and you can control the drift easier. So that is the thing I would add. And probably a bit more on two-handed fishing with double-handed rods, particularly for trout. People love swinging flies. There's something about swinging a fly in the current on a long cast that appeals. I think that there's more to be said there.
You know, I get it for the salmon. I wouldn't have thought that for trout, people really getting into it, but it makes sense.
Yeah, people just really enjoy the two-handed casting aspect of it, which is kind of the opposite from that Euro nymphing, because Euro nymphing, really, there's not much casting involved. It's more like a flick of the wrist, but two-handed casting requires a lot more manipulation of the line.
What about saltwater fly fishing? Do you feel like that would be something you'd need to underscore a little bit more, Tom? I know for me personally, saltwater fly fishing is about to drive me to the poorhouse. I mean, I've got multiple home equity lines of credit running just so I can afford to get after these things all over the place. Just got back from Mexico with Hillary Hutchison, was down there last week with her in Ascension Bay. So maybe it's just my perspective, but I would still think that saltwater fly fishing has really come a long ways in the last decade.
Yeah, it has, and that could be definitely improved, particularly the flies. I think that the tackle hasn't changed that much. I mean, the rods are better. They can cast farther. They're stronger now. But the flies have changed quite a bit, and they will change every year. I mean, the innovative flies that are coming out of the saltwater field now is just mind-boggling, and they're a lot of fun.
Speaking of innovation, it is time that we talk about the Helios fly rod. Eddie, you throw Tom the first question.
Yeah. I know that Helios is a freshwater tool as well, but I'm certainly more familiar with it in the saltwater environment. As a matter of fact, last week I had 2 of the latest Helios rods out and really enjoyed casting those. I don't know if you'll agree with this, Tom, but let me just throw this out here. I'm going to say that the advent of the Helios rod line, when was that? When did that come out? Do you remember the first one?
The first one, oh boy. All the years run together for me, Eddie, but I'm thinking 10 years ago, maybe.
We're in generation 4 now, which
Right.
isn't called the 4,
Yeah.
but it is generation 4. But
Right.
when those came out, in my mind, that represented a purposeful, proactive shift in the Orvis arsenal. I think it's fair to say that the brand had lost some of its luster among the hardcore fishing crowd, but that the Helios rod and then moves like the Pro Series of apparel, they just kind of put the angling world on notice that Orvis was roaring back, which I think it has. Is it fair or not fair, Tom?
No, I think you're exactly correct, Eddie. Prior to the Helios, the Orvis rod design was very conservative. And I think the biggest mindset in the Orvis rod shop was we want to make rods that don't break. And as a result, they were heavier, and they were heavier in the tip in particular. And some people liked that, but the popularity was going towards rods that were faster. By faster, I don't mean stiffer, but I mean they had a lighter tip.
Right.
It wasn't until Jim Logan took over the rod shop, and now Don Swanson with Sean Combs and Frank Horde as the designers, that they really started pushing the envelope. It did catch a lot of people's attention and really changed the perception of Orvis. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Duck Camp knows that life is not a highway. It's more like a gravel road where the asphalt ends and a chalky white cloud rises up behind to let you know good things lie ahead. Duck Camp's best in-class fishing and hunting apparel has been tested out there, from Alaska's backcountry to the duck blinds of Louisiana. From buttery soft bamboo sun hoodies to brush pants to iconic Game Series hats, you can gear up for your next gravel road moment at duckcamp.com. What's sort of the design philosophy around the Helios line? Break that down. What makes a Helios a Helios?
The first Helios was we want to make the lightest rod. We want to make the lightest 905, 908. That was the first and the second generations, really. And the only reason I know the background of this intimately is because Sean Combs, the rod designer, is probably my best fishing buddy. And so we spend a lot of time talking rods and reels and lines and stuff like that. But we were thinking, okay, we had Helios 2. What else do people want? We did some research with customers and guides and really realized that, fly fishing is a game of inches, regardless of whether you're tarpon fishing or trout fishing. And we wanted to make the most accurate fly rod in the world. Well, how do you do that? And Sean said, well, the thing is you got to reduce vibration, right? Because the tip directs where the line goes. So if you can make a rod still flex and feel good, but cut down that vibration on the tip, it's going to put the fly where you point your finger. And so the Helios 3, we wanted to be the most accurate fly rod in the world. And we actually developed a machine that measures the vibration reduction in a fly rod, and we compared it to all the competition and our older models and so on. For the fourth generation, numerous fishing trips, I said, Sean, what the hell are you going to do next? I mean, the Helios 3s are so good. He said, well, I'm going to make it more accurate and I'm going to make it stronger.
Right.
And I said, all right, good luck. And I was kind of a doubter at first that he could make a rod that improved on the Helios 3, but they did. It's even more accurate. And people say, well, it's only the ability of the caster that matters, right? It's not the rod. Well,
right.
Even if you're a great caster, if your rod's wiggling at the end, you're not going to put that fly consistently where you want it. And even a novice can appreciate that difference, because if a novice can point his or her finger and their cast is halfway decent, then it's going to get closer to the target if the rod isn't wobbling at the end. So he did it.
When the new Helios first came out, it was, the marking line was 4 times more accurate. And I'm like, what is that? What does that mean? I mean, I could use 4 times more accuracy. I guarantee it. But throwing that rod in Mexico, it's different. It does tend to go where you tell the rod to go, so you better tell that rod where to go.
Yeah.
Yeah. Tom, there's something else that I did not realize that you're involved in. It's something that all the cool kids do. Let's talk about tattoos. I hear you have tattoos, and I'll tell you, when I was in Mexico, my son, Jack, I took him down there with me, and he was hammering on me to get a father-son tattoo, and I came very close, but I chickened out last minute and just bought a third bracelet instead. But let me hear about your tats, Kat. I'm impressed.
Well, I only have two. I have a sparkle done on one wrist and a sort of a Clouser bonefish fly on the other. Not wrist, forearm, I guess. I was at the New Jersey fly fishing show with Julia Zima, our social media person, and we're walking around. She said, let's do something live on Instagram. And I said, okay. She said, what should we do? And I said, I don't know. There's, a friend of mine from Cuba, Felipe, who is here, and he'd be interesting. And then there's a guide from Mongolia that's here. We could talk to them. And we're standing next to this booth that was doing tattoos, and they were doing a bang-up business. I mean, there were people lined up to get tattoos at the show. And they were doing fish and flies and stuff like that. She says, why don't you get a tattoo? And I said, no f***ing way. And I said, no, I'm not getting a tattoo. I never thought of getting a tattoo in my life. And she said, all right. And I looked over and I said, well, yeah, okay, let's do it. And tattoo artist, he made room for me in the line, and we put it on Instagram Live. And I was walking back to the Orvis booth after I got the tattoo. And some guy comes up to me and says, hey, I heard you got a tattoo. I said, yeah, where'd you hear that? He said, oh, from my son who's in Iraq. He just saw it live on Instagram in a space of like 3 minutes. So the next year I got another one on my other wrist. And then they haven't been at the show, so I haven't gotten another tattoo. So I only have two.
And tell me the significance of the sparkle done.
Well, it's just my favorite dry fly. You know what? I'm never going to regret having a sparkle done tattoo, right?
There's some words of wisdom. I'm never going to regret having a sparkle done tattoo.
Yeah, I'm never going to regret having a sparkle done or a bonefish fly on my wrist. I didn't tell my wife until I had it done.
I was going to ask this question.
And I called her and I said, hey, I got a tattoo. And she said, cool. You're the only guy I ever dated that didn't have one.
She fell in love with the nerd, huh? She knew it on the front end.
I know. I don't know why, but she's still with me and seems to be relatively happy.
Let's talk a little bit about carp.
Carp, yeah. Yeah, man.
Yeah. Eddie and I are obsessed with brook trout, and I know, Tom, you are too, and we can circle back to them. But I also have heard that you are obsessed with carp.
I am.
With the fly.
Yeah.
Where's that happening? Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I'm not going to tell you exactly where it's happening because carp spots are like grouse covers.
Yeah.
Because you have to find carp in clear water and shallow water where they feed. You can find a lake with the carp all over the place, but if they're just kind of cruising from one place to the next, or you can't see them, you can't catch them with a fly. You have to find them where the places where they go in and root on the bottom and tail like redfish or bonefish. So I get as excited about a carp trip the night before as I do about going striped bass or bone fishing.
What's the pattern?
Well, there is no pattern. That's the thing. Every watershed seems to be different, and they have different food supply. You have to get them where they're feeding. You have to get them with their head down, where they're tailing or feeding.
Right.
And generally, you throw it just beyond them.
Yeah.
And then you do what's called a drag and drop. You carefully strip the fly and let it drop right in front of them.
Got it.
And it's all visual. That's why it's so exciting. You can't catch them blind fishing. Well, you can, but it's nearly impossible.
Are they eating bugs or organic vegetation?
They're pretty good predators. They eat a lot of crayfish. They eat damselfly nymphs. They'll eat anything.
I didn't know that. Yeah.
And in fact, in the Great Lakes, they eat gobies. And I've never been there, but like at Beaver Island, Michigan, those fish will actually chase down a stripped streamer. because they're eating gobies.
What size is a, for lack of a better word, trophy carp?
I don't know. I think bigger than 10 pounds.
Oh, it's big.
I've caught them in the
Yeah.
20s.
Wow.
It's the only freshwater fish I know of, non-anadromous freshwater fish, that will get you into your backing. And some of them get you well into your backing.
Oh, wow.
They do not give up. They're tough, tough fish.
Tell us about a particular carp. Tell us about a carp that really, really got you going.
Oh, God, lots of them. Well, I had a terrible carp year last year, so we had a lot of high water, and a couple of places I fish are rivers, and they were just too dirty and high to fish most of the summer. But I do fish on Lake Champlain, which has a lot of giant carp, and they're almost impossible to catch. I have a friend who guides up there for things like gar and bass and lake trout, and we go and chase carp. The things I remember are the places where I just couldn't get them to eat. I think there's a lot to be learned about carp fishing. I don't think we've even scratched the surface. I think probably smaller flies, 8s and 10s and 12s, maybe 14s.
Wow.
Might be the way to go, and you're probably going to bend out those hooks on a big carp.
But, there's a number of these species that are sort of on the shoulder of traditional fly fishing. Carp be one. I mean, you mentioned gar. I mean, I've loved catching gar on rope flies.
Oh, that's fun, yeah.
Yeah.
Bowfin is another one that a lot of people want to catch, yeah.
Talk to us about that, Tom, because, look, there's a lot of pressure on some of these rivers and streams.
Yeah.
These other fish, man, they offer some real opportunity.
I've spent more time on Lake Champlain. It's a couple hours from me, but it's got everything. And my buddy Drew Price, who's the guide up there, will call me and he'll say, hey, the lake trout bite's on. I said, I don't want to catch any lake trout. But he'll call me and he'd say, the gar are on top. And I'll say, yeah, man, I'm in. And we'll be going to a gar spot or a carp spot. And he'll say, oh, my God, look at the size of that smallmouth. And I said, yeah, forget it. But there's a fish in Lake Champlain called the tench, which was introduced from Europe somehow. And they're like impossible to catch, super spooky. And I haven't hooked one yet. Bowfin fishing is interesting because in most cases, what they don't tell you about bowfin is they're way back in the weeds, and you have to find a pocket in the weeds where a bowfin is just kind of sitting there. And they're not spooky at all. You could put your boat right on top of them, and you kind of lower a fly down to them. It's like dapping or jigging, and you twitch it in front of them, and all of a sudden they just explode on it.
Wow.
There's not a lot of casting involved. I'm sure there are places people fish for bowfin where you can do normal casting. Where we do it, it's just dapping flies in weed pockets.
So, Tom, you also hunt wood ducks?
Yeah, I hunt ducks.
You have a dog? You have a retriever?
Yeah, I have a lab.
Yeah, I know you have this idyllic setup where you have a little bit of a stream in essentially your backyard. Do you hunt there, or where do you?
Yeah, I've gotten to be a lazy hunter, and unfortunately, I used to go different places, especially up to Lake Champlain, which is great duck hunting. But all my friends that had boats either moved away or died. And so what I do is I get up early in the morning and I take 3 or 4 deeks, and there's a slough on the little trout stream in my backyard, and I throw a couple deeks in and sit there and drink coffee, and usually I don't see any ducks, but I used to have an amazing population of black ducks in my backyard.
Really? Wow.
And they've disappeared. I don't know. Maybe they changed the farming practices in the valley because it's a dairy farming valley that I live in, but I don't see many black ducks anymore. Wood ducks, yeah, some mallards.
You also forage. You and I have geeked out before talking about chanterelle mushrooms and things like that.
Yeah.
That's a favorite of yours, right?
Well, my wife and my kid don't fish, but we spend most weekends, both days, in the woods foraging. My kid is an incredible botanist. They're 19 and really knows the plants. My wife and I have always been mushroomers. We started that when we first met, but they introduced us to greens and buds and roots. And so, yeah, we just go and forage. One of my kind of special meals is to go out and get some chanterelle mushrooms and some brook trout and cook them up on the stream bank.
Tom, I used to talk about doing something similar minus the chanterelles because I didn't know about them yet. Look, I don't kill many fish at all, but I've always dreamt of being able to have a shore lunch of a brook trout and throw chanterelles on.
Well, you have an open invitation, David. It's easy to do. anytime from 4th of July through end of August.
Wow.
I love eating fish that I've caught right away. A couple of summers ago, I set myself a goal, which I did not meet. I wanted to catch, cook, and eat a fish once a week.
Mm-hmm.
Like right there.
Yeah.
On the beach or on the shore or at the pond.
Uh-huh.
I kept it up for, I don't know, 4 or 5 weeks while the bluegills are biting well. But
Mm-hmm.
I love that notion of completing the circle, so to speak. I catch and release fish 95% of the time. But I like that idea of eating what you catch, acknowledging that circle in a meaningful way. Is that something that appeals to you?
It does. It does a lot, Eddie. And unfortunately, the fish that I like to eat, I don't catch, like black cod or regular cod, salmon, bluefish. I'd whack every bluefish on the head that I caught. I love eating bluefish.
I love a bluefish.
But yeah, it's just that the fact that the fish I like to fish for, I don't like to eat as much.
You need you a farm pond filled with Georgia giants up there is what it sounds like. Sounds like big old bluegill.
I do.
Speaking of the fish you like to catch, Tom, I'd love to hear a couple of fish stories. Any fish you went after that really sticks in your mind, sticks in your craw?
You know, it's a really hard one, Eddie, because every one of them is a challenge and every one is different and the variables change. And I mean, I remember one in my backyard. So my backyard stream has mostly small trout. And I remember going down right before dark one night and saw a fish rise. I had a little bamboo rod that I was using and I hooked the fish. You know, it was like 14-inch brown trout, which is a monster for there. And he tore up the pool and he ran downstream and I had to follow him. And I thought, boy, this is cool to be able to do in my backyard. This is really cool. But other than that, you know, every one of them is a different challenge. And
any that really just whipped your ass, Tom?
For fodder, the one I remember the most, but I wasn't fly fishing. I was probably 11 years old, and I'd taken a John boat to a barrier island to try and catch a big redfish, which I had seen and read about in magazines, but I had never done it myself, and I didn't necessarily have surf fishing mentors. And I threw out a chunk of mullet in the fall with a spinning rod that was way too small, and I mean, almost instantly got hit. And this redfish starts just screaming off drag. And after 50 yards or so, just kind of stopped and put its nose down, and its tail came up above the surface. And it was a fairly calm day. I had never seen a redfish tail like that in my life. I'm talking knees shaking, and I'm thinking, I've done it. And then it came down, and it just continued to go out to sea until I'm looking at my spool just coming off that spinning reel. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to tighten, and finally, bing! And I cried. I mean, I got down and cried. I mean, I wanted that fish so bad. That's the one I remember the most, the one that, for one, showed me how outgunned and what I didn't know, but also showed me what was out there.
That's just a couple of months ago, right?
yeah.
I could use a good cry, Eddie.
But none that whipped you, Tom? Let me hear a whipping story.
How about a tarpon that just took you to task?
Yeah.
Yeah. My biggest tarpon I ever hooked was in the Northern Everglades, and it didn't jump. It was about 150 pounds, and it never jumped. And you guys know when tarpon doesn't jump, they're going to just go forever. And I'm in fairly good shape. I work out. My arms are strong. My shoulders and chest are strong. And we finally leadered that fish, and I said, I'm never doing this again. And there was another time, talking about losing fish, that I used to chase bluefin tuna with a fly rod back when gas was a little cheaper, and I was hanging around on Cape Cod a lot. And the guides, if they had a day off, they really wanted to get a fly rod tuna on their boat. That would have been a pretty cool thing. So they'd grab me because they knew that I would not stop fishing all day. And I remember this big pot of tuna coming at us. We never chummed or anything. We would just go, looking for whales and stuff. And this big tuna took my fly and instantly broke me off. And for years, the guides on Cape Cod would call me Tom Broke 'em Off.
Oh, I love it. That's a good one. Well, look, if people have hung around for this long, let's assume that they're pretty avid anglers, Tom. And one of your signature podcast moves are when you take the letters from listeners,
Yep.
posing all sorts of questions.
Yep.
We want to do a little bit of that here, but this time you don't get the benefit of being able to know what the question is in advance and think up a cool, witty, awesome answer. So there's going to be a little pressure on it. And I'm going to go first. Dear Tom Rosenbauer, while fishing, what is the maximum number of Orvis logos I can get away with having on my body and on my gear at one time? This includes rods, reels, waders, bags, knee braces, hearing aids, orthotic inserts, everything. What's the cutoff, Tom?
I think the limit is determined by your taste, Eddie. And I think that probably 2 or 3 is sufficient, and you should cover the rest of them up with duct tape.
Oh, I better get a big old roll of duct tape. 2 or 3, that's it.
Wow.
I'm surprised.
Yeah, I think so.
right,
That's
all
enough. That's enough.
Yeah.
All right. Dear Mr. Rosenbauer, is my southern cane pole any different than a Tenkara rod?
Dear David, it depends on your perspective. Is your southern cane pole retractable into a nice little package?
Yes, a very good point.
I mean, people make fun of Tenkara, but it's actually, you do actually cast with it. It's not a cane pole. You do actually cast with them, and there's there's some skill involved there. But yeah, you can dap with them too. You can use them like a cane pole.
Yeah, but I do like the fact that they retract.
Yeah, that makes them nice.
Tom, is there an environmental concern? I mean, obviously we have a lot. We've got global warming. We've got everything going on. Everglades. Is there something that's top of mind for you and on the conservation front when it comes to the sport that we love?
Yeah, there's a few things. Global warming, of course, is the existential threat. And unfortunately, I don't think there's much that most of us can do about that until society as a whole realizes that we have to do something. But the Everglades is a biggie. And in the old days, Orvis used to just do like 2 or 3 conservation projects a year and then move on to the next project. And we finally realized that these things are multi-generational, and we have to keep the heat on certain things that are so important and so valuable to us that we have to stay on a particular project for years and years. And the Everglades is one where there's progress being made, and we've got over 100 years of plumbing to fix down there, and it's never going to be pristine, but we're working toward a more robust ecosystem in the Everglades in Florida Bay, and that one is really, really big with me, and with Orvis, obviously. Bristol Bay is another one. We've hopefully stopped that mine, but it's not going to go away. Bristol Bay is a big piece of water, and there's probably a lot of minerals there. And it's probably going to be beyond our lifetime, this fight for preserving the largest sockeye salmon run in the world.
Yeah, and that's a giant Alaskan issue up there with a pebble mine that was proposed. And my understanding, there was a sort of a stake in the heart of that thing that we thought, and then it came back a little bit. What's the status of the Bristol Bay issues these days?
Well, I hope I get it right, but the Department of the Interior put a stop to the mine, and then the state of Alaska tried to overturn that, and they lost just recently. Mm-hmm. But it's going to rear its ugly head again. And luckily, the people from Trout Unlimited know that this is going to be a lifelong struggle, and they're dedicated to not only people at Trout Unlimited, but the Alaskan natives are very concerned about this and have been leading the fight. But right now, it's dead, but doesn't mean it's not going to come out of the grave.
Mm-hmm.
The one final thing that I personally worry about is the overuse of pesticides and herbicides. I think that that's an insidious problem that's kind of invisible because they're difficult to monitor and they're difficult to sample. In particular, these neonic pesticides that are being used are really decimating our trout stream insects, I'm convinced, and that's the food supply for the fish that we love.
And I guess the good news in that is that we're becoming so much more aware of these issues that we never really thought about. I mean, that brings to mind the pharmaceuticals issue in South Florida, right? With the bonefish and then the redfish and the shrimp and crabs. So we are learning that we each individually and specifically do impact the environment.
We do. Yep. There are things we can do. We may not be able to do much about climate change, but there are other things that we can do to make the environment we have better.
Well, gentlemen, it is sadly time to close this up. But Tom, it has been a pleasure to have you on our podcast. We appreciate what you do for the sport that we love and the environment where we enjoy that sport in. So, as I said, I'm coming your way, I promise, to join you for lunch on the side of a creek with a freshly caught brook trout.
Well, thank you, David. It's been fun, and it's been my pleasure. And Eddie, thank you. And you're welcome on that brook trout trip too, Eddie.
Well, now I got to say, I was a little hurt with you guys going all BFF on me over your 20 years of friendship. I've never even met you. So, yes, we'll be there soon. All right, Tom, thanks so much. This has been fabulous. Look forward to crossing paths.
Thanks, Tom. Be good. See ya.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. It's been fun. I really enjoyed it.
Man, what a cool dude. Lives up to all the hype. That's a wrap for this episode. Another great conversation with a legend of the fly fishing universe.
And folks can get a lot more of Tom Rosenbauer and the Rosenbauer Way. He's got his own internet-breaking podcast called the Orvis Fly Fishing Podcast, which you really should check out, but only after you listen to all of our episodes 3 times.
Well done, Eddie. The Wild South comes to you from Garden & Gun Magazine. This episode was produced and edited by Christine Fennessy, with music by our longtime buddies, Woody Platt and Bennett Sullivan. You can find us wherever you get your shows.
And whenever you go to wherever you get your shows, leave us a review. We want to hear what you think of the Wild South.
All right. From here in Charleston, I'm Dave DiBenedetto.
And here in Raleigh, North Carolina, Eddie Nickens. We'll see you next time on the Wild South.